Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. It's my great pleasure to introduce my guest tonight. Rudi Dex's career started in the labor movement, where he held multiple leadership roles in COSATU and its affiliates. From 2008 to 2013, he was the executive director of COSATU's policy and research think tank, Naledi. Since then, he has worked in government, in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and now he is in the presidency. He is head of the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the President, and he is the co-lead of Operation Vulindlela, a joint initiative between the presidency and the National Treasury, established to accelerate the government's reform agenda. Welcome, Rudi, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you for that kind introduction.
Well, let me get into it. Let's start with the big picture on reform. You have said that we need to be frank and honest about what's broken in the South African state. Let's start there. What do you think is the hardest truth South Africans need to confront about reform?
It's a vexed question, right? I mean, it's so difficult to say one sort of answer on this. But I mean, when we started on the reform agenda, I mean, the one thing that baffled us was the fact that there was, firstly, an understanding of the policy environment, and secondly, the inability to implement stuff that have been decided upon, you know? Now, that may be true for a whole series of reasons. There may just be that people don't quite understand how to manage this. But it may also be that there's no capacity, there's no research, there's no technical capacity, financial capacity, capacity to understand how to monitor, for example, capacity to even implement, because implementation of some of the complex reforms is not easy. You got to think through them. So I think for me those were the most important sort of challenges. And then of course, how do you do that? How do you fix that? Where do you start? Because that was the sort of difficult thing. Like, okay, it's a system that is not entirely broken. I'll be very cautious about that. I think the system works in some instances and in other instances doesn't. And I think it's about how do we develop that by building our experience and pockets and making sure we can replicate that elsewhere. So, from a reform point of view, I think those were the initial challenges. I think there is generally, for me, and I want to preface this, I mean, I think that people underestimated the level of the state capture. And you think about state capture generally, and as about people stealing money, but it was actually the degradation of the capacity of people that were good public servants, that were capable public servants, DGs, chief directors, directors even, deputy directors hounded out of the system, that were honest, that were frank, that were hardworking, that wanted to monitor, wanted to ensure implementation, and putting in people that simply would sit around and earn their salaries.
Mm, mm. So clearly a decimated state, as you've put it, and with enormous aftershocks of state capture. Is it realistic to expect meaningful reform from within a system that is so weakened? Is it perhaps the reason why reforms that look sensible on paper so often stall? What
Mm.
are the key barriers to getting things actually done, in your experience?
I mean, this is the sort of question, right? I mean, do you wait for capacity and then implement reform, or do you find a mechanism that says, how do we get reform going and we build capacity at the same time? Because ultimately, I mean, reform in itself or building capacity is not an end in itself. It requires for us to both do that. And for instance, for example, our experience in the project management office, and it was two of us, Saul and myself, right? And we looked at a whole series of people that were experts that we had to bring in from the private sector, from different parts of government, people that have left government, for example, and willing to come back again. So ultimately, you had to think about reform as a mechanism for building capacity. But also reform is complex. I mean, sometimes we take for granted when we say, we took a decision in 2004 to corporatize the Transnet National Port Authority. It's written in legislation. Then actually, when you do it, you think, oh my goodness me, okay, so what's going to happen to the balance sheet of Transnet? Does it mean that if we fully take it out right now, what happens to the debt? Does it pass on to the sovereign? Do we have to think about how we transact? The point about operations and infrastructure is an important separation, but it requires complex thinking through and the right sort of people to get that don't necessarily do that. Similarly, when we were doing the groundbreaking work on the Electricity Regulatory Act, I mean, how did we understand market mechanisms of setting up the rules for market or market code, or what it means in terms of separation, or the fact that we needed to create a wholesale electricity market and have a separate NTCSA? What does that mean? Does that mean, for instance, that you're going to be a subsidiary of Eskom? How do we make sure that there are fair rules and grid access? We have never done this before, and never. We've had it since 1998, but we've never taken that bold enough step to say, actual fact, we're going to do this. So reform in itself is an important part and it has to link with capability and capacity. And I've shown examples of how we can do that. But you can't wait for capacity for these things to happen. They're also complex and you got to find resources in the system in South Africa, global experiences, global people to be able to do. I mean, the one thing I always criticize us is that we're not really good at developing partnerships, right? Sometimes even inter-government partnerships don't even exist, right? You find this complexity like, and my treasury colleagues will knock me, right, when I say it's difficult for intra-departments to come together, for departments, for example, like treasury and presidency, and we work together. We found a mechanism. And that was part of the breaking down of the state. The one that was, before 2007, where coordination from the presidency, coordination from lead departments, the ability to bring together different departments. And what we inherited was silos, departments doing this. I recall one meeting, the president had asked us to present on the just energy transition. And four different departments presented their own views. And he said, this is crazy, guys. I can't, can you please come together? And my office will help you to come together. So we present one document, not four documents. So broken system in that sense was an important part of the mechanism of bringing together that coordination. And I'm hoping that we have been able to play that role. We've been able to do that.
Mm,
Partnerships externally also, and sometimes people think when we develop a partnership with business colleagues or sincere in building capacity, we got to be, you got to be risk averse to the interests because there are people there that have interest. They offer the support because they think they may get some contracts for government. We got to weed that out, and it's sort of easy to weed out. But when there's genuine offering from business people to say, look, this is not our sector. We don't work here. But we can offer you financing people that understand complex transactions like Eskom and Transnet. We're prepared to give you those people to work through some of the complexity. We've got to take that up. And that's what we've done. And I think that's how you do this. You've got to build that, take that capacity, build it as we go along, and ensure where there's specific capacity gaps, we take people there so they can be trained and learned.
mm. I'm going to come back to that interesting issue, but some people would say that South Africa has fallen into a low growth trap where no one genuinely expects faster growth, so no one invests in anticipation of benefiting from that growth. And then low investment guarantees that growth doesn't in fact happen. Do you agree with that analysis? And if so, can Operation Vulindlela genuinely reverse this path? Or is it just buying time in a way before South Africa somehow gets the political coalition or the courage or whatever it is, the leadership to undertake the deeper political and fiscal reforms that need to happen but aren't happening? How do we get out of this low growth trap in your view?
Absolutely. So I agree with that part, right? And I thought that I think the president when he formed the project, when he asked us to form the project management office and endorsed Operation Vulindlela in the sixth administration, many people don't realize in actual fact this started without the coalition. That tough choices, tough trade-offs, the role of the private sector, understanding their centrality, our role to be able to ensure that we unlock the regulatory environment, that we create competition. That was such an important part because ultimately we were on, as you say, a low growth trap. What causes that low growth trap? I mean, you can have consumption spending, and you've done lots of studies, and that it not just upgrow slightly and they go through peaks and troughs. But what ultimately drives growth is fixed capital formation. That's investment. No investment into buildings, investment into infrastructure, water, electricity, transport, roads. These are the critical things that drive that. Now, if you want to grow above, let's say 3% that we say, you got to have an investment rate of 18 to 20% of GDP. We are doing under 15% or 14% as it is right now, last year's annual rate of investment as a percentage of GDP. So you've got a significant hurdle to climb. In my view, I do think that the reforms can be a catalytic way of getting that investment. So let me use one example, electricity. I mean, that schedule, and I mean, before we did the air, we said, okay, we're going to put the cart slightly before the horse. We said we're going to change Schedule 2, right? And Schedule 2 was a simple thing, and you could read it in a way, and you think, but what's wrong with the Schedule 2? Well, the wrongness of the Schedule 2 was that we wanted to tweak it to a mechanism that allows for private sector investment. So Schedule 2 does allow for private sector investment. But for own build, right? Or on your property behind the meter. It meant that if I had a factory right here on my property, I could build as big a plant as possible, but I can't transmit it across the network. I could only use it for my own use. So the fundamental overhaul of breaking down that vertically integrated system was saying you can build for own use and for off-takers elsewhere on the system, which therefore meant that you could transmit, you could build an 800 megawatt plant and you could have multiple customers. That was phenomenal. And what we did see, right? I remember someone had asked me, where is your private sector investment, right? One person did. I won't say where the person is at. Where is your private sector investment? I said, just wait, wait. We then set up a red tape regulatory team that eventually morphed into the Energy One Stop Shop that's played a critical role right now. And when we saw the first quarter results of the first quarter reports from NERSA in 2023, we saw an exponential jump, exponential. And that was it. And you saw that graph go like a graph is still going like this on the amount of registered projects. Now, registration is one step before you achieve financial close and you grade your grade access. But what it did do in 2023, when we saw the data, was that you saw a sudden jump in construction employment, and you saw a sudden jump from 14.2% to 15%, just slightly over 15% of gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP. So we knew that that particular decision of that tweak could make a potential impact on growth. And today we track about 22 gigawatts, 22 gigawatts. Now, just let me give you a good sense of this. 22 gigawatts on any given day, Eskom does 35,000 megawatts, 22,000 megawatts. So that's more than a half, to close to two-thirds of the total capacity that Eskom produces on any given day. And then the private sector guys do the surveys, for example, and they started tracking the surveys of projects in development in renewable and hybrid projects. The first one was done in 2022, and it was 33 gigawatts of projects in development. In 2023, that jumped to 133 gigawatts,
Hmm.
135. They just released their survey results a few weeks ago. 240, that's 240,000 megawatts compared to 35,000 megawatts. So if that latent demand is unlocked, we get the regulatory stuff, we get the grid access, we allow the rules to be clear, we create a competitive market. That is just itself massive, massive investments that we can unlock. That's just one example. I can go on about rail, for example, water, or telecommunications. But certainly it is not the be all and end all. There are also demand side measures. But I certainly think it has an ability to unlock massive, massive amounts of capex investments in the economy, in the network sector.
Great. So we're getting private sector investment, but we're struggling on the public sector side to move up from 13, 14%. I'll come back to that. I've often criticized government for saying that we don't have a common diagnosis of why South Africa is in so much trouble on so many fronts. Let's go back to 2020. What was the core diagnosis that led to the creation of Operation Vulindlela? And has that diagnosis of the core reasons we're in such trouble, has that diagnosis changed over the 5 years of its operation?
I think the diagnosis has not changed, but it's evolved, right? And so it has evidence that in actual fact, the decisions that you took on that 2019 paper around the network sectors and reforming them, right? Telecommunications, water, electricity, visa systems, and of course, energy, that we took the right decision. And so this is an important step in that, right? But unlocking that is just one area, right? We got to make sure that you carry through the reform, got to do it fast. You got to make sure that you can create the confidence. So a lot of what we've done has created the environment for us to see higher levels of growth later on. I mean, we were hoping that some of this stuff would come through quite sooner. I think for us that's the first step. Can we change what we have control over? And that's why we chose those five reforms area. I mean, they're just fundamental. That's just easily. I mean, we have the most onerous visa system. We are now one of the most important and critical areas where we revolutionize, and one of the top countries that have a state-of-the-art visa system, from a critical skills visa, temporary, sorry, the employment, the trusted employer scheme, a points-based system. We're moving into a electronic travel authorization that we've now launched for that. I'm just saying that was in our control. Similar for energy, similar for transport. What we've created is an opportunity for the private sector. Now we've got to create a confidence that we're not going to change that. And I think that's what you're sort of hinting towards. That for us, that was the most important and first step, that we can make the policy shift that is ideologically sometimes very different and difficult to do, and that we've got to make those changes. And sometimes those ideological shift is not a big ideological shift. It's certainly because we've adopted an economy where competition is critical, that we've got to play a regulatory role, but we also got to play a developmental role, because the private sector is not going to deal with every part of the economy. For me, I think that has been the most important part. And it lays the basis for us to be able to say, how do we now ensure that we're consistent, we create confidence, we have the best regulatory environment, and we're able to attract capital into those areas. And I can see that happening. So people are a bit hesitant, but if I engage with banks, for example, I engage with a lot of the banks, and some of them invite me to the capital allocation committees. And it's astonishing the amount of capital they allocate for private sector investments as a result of the reforms. And they would ask me, so tell me, is this reform really going to happen? I said, yeah, it's going to happen. How can you be sure? I said, well, because we're monitoring and making sure that it does happen on the 1st of January. And they would come back and say, okay, you did make it happen. So tell us again, what's the next reform? I said, that's the next reform. So I do think it has laid the basis. Now, it's not going to be the be all. We've got to, I mean, the point about the reforms, and that some of us mistake it as the economic policy. It is a component of economic policy. It's the component of the economic changes that we've got to make. We've got to deal with aspects, for example, that are not in the reform. Education system, both basic and post-school, safety and security, and the fact that organized crime has completely run rampant and we're not responding adequately enough. We've got to deal with trade and investment, for example. You've got to deal with various other demand side measures that are going to be quite critical. So it is a cog, albeit one of the most important cogs in an overall strategy that I think we've got to implement.
Mm. So I suppose the question now, which a leading academic asked me recently, he said, do we have the right diagnosis? And that's why I'm emphasizing this, because we're still not getting growth. So, for example, if more attention had been paid to fixing, as you've just mentioned, the criminal justice system right from the beginning, would it have helped South Africa more? If we had prioritized the mining sector, for example, where finally, the head of Anglo American came clean with the country when he said that we have lost a generation of mining because of the regulatory environment. We haven't put money into exploration for the last 20 years. This is pretty devastating. So,
Mm.
obviously, where you start reform really matters. And we had to do something about energy and logistics because the economy was coming to a standstill. But have we had the right other priorities? Is really the question I'm asking. And as we sit with, you know, less than 1% growth last year and a lot of people pushing their growth projections down for this year, how do we feel about the diagnosis? This is
I
it's a hard
know
question.
it
How do we
is, and you're pushing me to give a.
feel?
I if you go back historically, I thought the diagnosis is important. So there were weaknesses in it, right? But here's what we sort of landed on. We're not good at prioritizing. So you could easily have, you could, this is the thing that you always write about, Anne. We got too many things that we want to do, right? And colleagues like yourself genuinely raise things and said, how can you have an empty DP that has all these hundreds of items, right? And this is precisely what we did. We took that diagnosis of what we can do immediately that's in our control, and we said those five things. Right? Now, there may not have been all the matters, and I agree with you entirely. I think
Mm,
if we, for example, did stuff on education and basic education, perhaps we had better outcomes for reading for meaning and numeracy. So we don't have this challenge when those who are in grade three are unable to read for meaning, a large percentage of them, or can count, or for the fact that we should have done more on policing. So we deal with the criminal elements and organized crime, or perhaps other things. I mean, there's a whole list of stuff. But I think, for example, so you can all do that, but I think much more would have dissipated the effectiveness of our work. And so it's why, for example, from an OV point of view, we took an approach of focusing on five, and then we said two of them are done, almost visas and telecommunications. And we said, look, let's look at some of the most pressing stuff, because I think if we ignored local government right now, right? I mean, the reforms are important, but as we go through local government, we can see big challenges, right? Significant challenges. Now, imagine if we didn't put local government on the agenda and say, okay, we'll do it for the next 5 years. I think you'll be asking that same question. Why did you not focus at local government? Because where it matters, where service delivery matters. You have no water distribution, functioning water distribution, no functioning electricity distribution. The roads are in disrepair and everything. So yes, I think you're probably right. We could have taken a whole series of different things, but I think that that's the problem. I think we needed to look at the prioritization, and there are trade-offs.
yeah.
What's
No.
quite nice, what's quite nice is that we've been, of course, debating this document that has been leaked in relation to the implementation plan of everything that we've already adopted, right? And we've integrated both education and safety and security elements into economic growth. So what has been quite, evidentially is the fact that you can't talk about economic growth, you can't talk about investment. If someone is coming to knock on a site and say, hey, pay me 30%, right? Um, or there's criminal activities where copper cables are being stolen, right? Thousands of kilometers a year. So you've got to build that into an economic sort of narrative, and I think you're spot on. But I'm just saying we can have many. I mean, there was Nick Spillhouse came to me and said, "Can you please for OV2 put basic education on there?" I said, "Okay, Nick. I mean, I hear you, And then another health professional came and said to me, can you please put basic, health on there, right? And we can do all of those things. But I think the effectiveness would have dissipated and be disparate. And I think the focus that we have to get the economy going, to see motions
Mm.
in the economy, I think we made the right choices. And I think we still made the right choices right now. What's helpful is the methodology. What's helpful is the capacity that we can build. Can we replicate this and have a conversation with the security cluster about organized crime? Can we go to the Minister of Basic Education and say, what can we do with an approach that we've done for OVI? So an OVI type of approach to say, how do we fix this? How do we zone in, laser focus on specific areas that is important around dealing with those poor outcomes? That's the conversation that I think we're sort of evolving into as well, man.
Well, that's going to be a really interesting conversation. But let me come back at this priorities question because it's hard and it's important. A lot of people have said one of the big successes of OV was that you did choose priorities. And you're always going to get people shouting and screaming about others, but you chose priorities. And people are worried that now that you've expanded your priorities in phase two, when you haven't achieved, not you, when we as the government hasn't achieved the full reform of, say, energy, for example, very difficult issues lie ahead. Business keeps telling us it's not going fast enough, especially with regard to logistics and ports and rail. And there's a lot still to be done. So, what is your response to this question of people being worried that OV now is going to expand its focus to very tough structural issues? Um,
I'm too
how
worried.
do you see that? Yeah.
No, you're spot on. I would also be worried. I mean, for me, is expanding the capacity, and I said to the team, we've got to expand the capacity. And I must be frank, many partners have come forward and say, how do we help you to expand that? And the same critique, and I take this, right? Um, I take it in a valid way that you haven't completed the reforms for electricity. You're well on the way. You've done some phenomenal stuff on the rail stuff. We haven't really talked about water, but there's some really good people in water and sanitation, like the DG himself and the ministers there, who are fully committed to reforming bulk water and having proper regulation in place, including water standards. So I do agree. But I think that in a sense, what we've done is created sufficient momentum to get across that threshold. So let's look at energy, for example. There are a couple of things that you can see which are raising concerns. Grid access, for example, given the grid limited and the rules have to be fair. I think working with NERSA, for example, and publishing grid access rules on the basis of the limitations that are there are important. We spot on track for the market launch, for the South African wholesale electricity market launch. And that's quite an important, albeit it being limited, it's an important first step towards creating a competitive market. So it might be very small. I think the fact that Eskom had taken a decision to withdraw their potential legal case against trading entities with the publishing of trading entity aggregators rules, and that's quite important. So I think that you got to what we do is religiously track and make lots of noise in the system to be able to ensure what is the next step, why are we delaying, why are we not being able to get across this. And I think that's an important part of the journey, and I think that's why we've chosen others. I think Minister Creese has been phenomenal with the reforms. It's very difficult with incumbents, right, like Eskom and Transnet, because as all incumbents are, and no reflection on the leadership here. And please, if they're listening, it's nothing to do with them. It's just the nature of incumbents, dominant players in the marketplace, public or private. They want to protect their space. Very difficult to understand the competitive rules and all of these other things. And so they want to manage it also. So we got to manage it because you don't also want a situation where 3 months later we got to pay another 240 or 80 billion rand to bail out someone. So you've got to manage this properly. But there's phenomenal stuff in transport. I mean, We have never had a network statement in all our history, right? We issued a network statement, which was the first step towards creating third-party access. And this is private sector train operators. Now, but I think people will say, well, there were 98 applications and 25 companies. We have given slots to 11 train operating companies. I know many of them were in the process of building their locals, purchasing them either locally or importing them, and are going to be serious players on the network, right?
Mm.
Now, we've done some modeling, and it seems as if we can get third-party access just with the volumes that are there right now, we're looking at additional 20 million tons from road to rail, right? Over the next 2 years. We have never been able to get an RFI or PSP out. I mean, the last PSP that we did was, of course, for Durban Container Terminal 2. That landed for 2.5 years in the court. I'm really happy that the different players have settled on it. I was quite impressed that the applicants had said, we agree now, let's just move ahead, right? So that's an important PSP. Durban Container Terminal, of course, is the largest container terminal on the African continent. It's one of the critical container terminals. We've got to get efficiency, private sector investment. We've never done this at. So I
Mm.
think these are the sort of confidence measures and stuff that we've got to talk through. Implementing is a different question, right? Whether the 49% stake and the issues around management and management responsibility. But the fact is that we've taken bold steps that have that have brought in the private sector is quite critical. And these are the important parts. We're forming the
Mm.
transport economic regulator. So I think people say we're slow. Well, of course. I mean, if we had the ability to say, like the man across the ocean, um, you know, um, he by decree can do this stuff. I'm certain if the president had the power of decree, you would say, decree this, right? We want the separation and unbundling to take place. I mean, our society is not that way, man. We've got a constitutional democracy. We've got to consult. We've got to follow processes. And I'm not using that to justify. I'm just saying I think sometimes these things are complex. Separating TNPA from Transnet is complex. I've
Mm.
never seen a complex transaction around unbundling. It is difficult. We have to get the
Mm.
best experts in. We've got to find the right people to manage it so that we don't find ourselves and landing in a mess around it. But we've got to follow the process. We've got to move it along.
So, Rudy, I certainly have an idea of how hard you and your team are working, and other departments or some departments with you. So take this question from whence it comes. South Africa's challenge at the moment is, on the one hand, you are introducing some new principles of governance and bringing the private sector in because, to be honest, the previous government destroyed what we had, and you've got to fix it and get onto a better road. So I understand that. But when I compare what's being done with what's needed, that's a very big challenge. And I imagine this worries you a lot because you and I can talk a lot about the intricacies of reform and your experience now in implementing, which has been so valuable, and the important job you've been doing. But when you compare it to where South Africa needs to be and the urgency of that, um, I think there are ways in which one could be operating much faster. Let me just give you one example. Your latest report dealing with rail and freight, which has been such a big problem, your latest report hopes to get back to the volumes of freight transported by rail that we last saw in 2016 only by 2030. Now, in this context of what I would call crisis, there are ways in a democracy in which you can speed things up. I, so the question is, don't we need to think out of the box even more? Don't we need greater urgency? And what is holding back progress or a great, a sort of push, a much faster push? Is it personalities of leadership? Is it vested interest pushing back? What is it? Because when I
Mm.
look at what needs to be done to get growth and employment going, we're very slow. Not that doesn't mean you're slow. It's the
No, we are
machinery of
slow. I
government
yeah,
is
yeah,
slow.
I totally agree with you. We are super slow around some of these things. Um, so let's use that example, and I mean, the 220 million tons, or getting back to the 2017 target is quite so just interesting. 200 million is a sort of threshold where you see that sort of growth happening. You see
Right.
exports driven, you get here's the challenge that we sit with, right? So we have no fiscal space, right? So how do we do this? And the treasury guys have been quite clear. We're not going to bail you out. We're not going to give you money in the way that we did with Eskom. That no longer exists. We've got to bring in the private sector on some of those things. What has happened, for example, is that because of the inability for us to invest in maintenance of the freight rail network, our freight rail network is in a substandard state. So what happens is that physically you can only move at a particular speed, which is referred to as speed restrictions. If you move faster, they derail, right? Train tracks break and snap. Overhead cables are also worn out. So now you've got a situation where you've got to invest in that. Now, any estimates put it probably at about 220 billion rand of capex investment just in the rail freight network, right? That's just the per way, the electricity, the communication networks, the overhead cables, the balustrades, all those things, right, are required to do that. We don't have the money. What Transit has done is creative. They said they gone to the customers, for example, and said, hey, all you want is to move your stuff from pit to port. How can we work together to make this work? Right? And so interesting, there is a process of having a collaborative framework where customers say, look, we can help you procure a piece of metal or a piece of this. And can we offset that against our tariff charges, for example, to do that? So these are the innovative stuff that have not been announced yet because it still has to go through some of the governance stuff. But there is definitely that innovation that does happen. Um, there's another conversation, for example, around electricity prices that have exponentially increased, and many of the steel or ferrochrome guys are struggling. And they look at that innovation with us around how we bring down the cost, right? And how is it that we can keep smelting going, for example. So I think there's a lot of it that we may not probably announce yet. But I mean, this transit one is phenomenal. And we had to get through the PFMA to make sure that we could get customers, as Michelle would say. She calls them customers. And this is not third party operators. This is the actual Kumba, for example, iron or Exaro, and say, hey guys, your network is in a terrible state. We all benefit if the network is there. We actually, unfortunately, don't have the money or the capex to do the investment right now. We're only going to do it in 3 years' time. How can we work together to fix this, to make sure that it does happen? And they come together. They've
But
collaborated
Rudy,
on.
even though people are coming together, business leaders, BLSA, they're saying it's not going fast enough. They've said it
Okay.
all year. So I understand the sort of new innovations you're getting going, but isn't there an issue of how do we do this with much greater speed? And maybe that's, you might tell me that's above your pay grade, but isn't that an important issue here? That the country isn't reforming fast enough for what we desperately need.
I, I
Do you
suppose
understand?
I, I suppose I could give the easy answer. It is above my pay grade when you want to work people in line. But it is about the level of accountability. And the president says that, I want
Mm.
you to be held accountable. I mean, you've set this time frame, work on it. I mean, I must be frank, yes, I'll take the criticism, some of the work that is quite slow. Um, but I mean, and I've been trying to explain at great pains to many people, we've not done this before, right? And some of it is slow, and some of it is that we sort of feeling our way around and trying to learn about competitive markets, and we bring in a whole series of people. Um, and I think we're moving. I mean, look at the report. Look at that report and say where we were in 2020. I think we've done phenomenal. And you can critique us on the slowness, but I think we've made some of the most important decisions that we couldn't take. We couldn't implement it because of a whole host of reasons. But
So let me get
yeah,
to some of
I
those
take the
reasons.
criticism. I take the
No, no,
criticism,
it's
and I
not a
take it. I
criticism
take
of
it.
you, it's of government as a whole. I have a million questions, but let me get to accountability because you've raised it, and it's often hard to know who is accountable for reform. We have the private sector, not shy at claiming a big role in its partnership with government in some areas. We have Operation Vulindlela, we have the presidency, we have the National Treasury. We have, so the first question is, what is the role of ministers, of cabinet ministers and their top officials in the accountability story?
They are the ones, and here I have to clarify this. It is not the role of OV. It is not the role of the presidency or the president. It is not the role of National Treasury. The reform and the responsibility for the reform relevant to the sector remains the responsibility of the department and the minister that's there. So the executive authority and the accounting authority have to own it, have to agree to that implementation plan, those 30 actions that can be cut across different that we've launched.
Mm.
So that's an important part. How do we build in the accountability? Firstly, what we've done is significantly improve performance agreements between the president and the minister. So that's quite important. We have it quite strictly, that reform. That you see in the document is precisely what is contained on the timeframes in the performance agreements between the president and the minister. That's an important part. That thing gets cascaded down to the DG, who concludes, and all the relevant, chief directors or deputy director generals that have to do that. So that's an important part of the performance system that is there. The second layer is that we've adopted much of what we've done, what others have done in the world, where we do stock takes. And the president is quite active in this. Can your minister and department tell me the progress that you've made? And the team says that you've not been able to achieve this. How do we ensure that we unlock this? The president has been quite active in picking up the phone, speaking to ministers, engaging ministers. What do you require to do that? So I think those are the levels of accountability. And more recently, the president has been quite clear. You have to pay the consequences if you do not deliver. You agree to these timeframes.
Mm.
And we say this to the departments. You've set these timeframes. Of course, we negotiate the timeframes and we push back and say, no, no, this is too late. But you've agreed to the timeframes. You've agreed to the action. Our responsibility is to monitor, to ensure that we're tracking it on target, and that we are able to provide support if you ask us for support, or even provide support even if you don't ask for support. So I
Yeah.
think that's the sort of level that's there. Ultimately, it's above my pay grade for someone to take the responsibility to say, well, minister, you're not doing this, or
Let me
that.
come to that, Rudy. So my big question is, would we need Operation Vulindlela if we had a better cabinet? We've just had in the past week one component of the GNU seems to have demoted a minister. Whatever sort of spin is put on it, he's been demoted. So, and that's for, I think, performance reasons. Are we going to see, because we haven't up till now seen any ANC ministers at any time, not to mention any other party, but the ANC is the most important, anybody else going to take accountability? So, how do we have a cabinet, costs us a lot of money. We have we have sort of officials. If we had much better quality people, more professional, all sorts of things, if we actually dealt with cadre deployment now, um, would we still need a role for Operation Vulindlela?
I'm a cadre being deployed, right, in the public service. I'm not a political cadre. I'm someone that, have been asked to work. I can't answer that question. I think your comments are sufficient enough. That's as you say, above my pay grade. I certainly think your point is an important part, right? we got to also deal with, if I talk about my level, which is the bureaucracy, we've got to do proper professionalization, right?
Yeah.
And here's something that I say regularly to colleagues. We are professional public servants. Come what may in political cycles, we've got to do what we've got to do. We've got to be able to ensure that that is an important part of the work, no matter what. And so stay the course. We got to be professional. We got to be capable. We got to train ourselves. We got to make the public service. And part of the sort of interventions is professionalizing so we can track young people and skill people into the public service, makes it exciting again. Um, but you're always going to have an OV. You're always going to have some form of a delivery mechanism where a head of state in his term of office would want to see his core programs wanting to do it. That's across the system. This is not unique only to to our head of state, His Excellency. This is all over. Tony Blair did it. Lulu has it also. He has a delivery mechanism. I know in some parts of Europe, governors who manage states, for example, in the US, have this kind
Mm.
of things. So you always want to be specific on making sure that there is something that you want, and it may not be the public service proper that will do it, although you want to see that capability develop. But a delivery unit is something good, and it has to have a limited lifespan, right? So, you can't have an OV in perpetuity. That's just running a parallel thing, right? I mean, ultimately, what are you trying to achieve? So you've got to have this quick wins. That's why I'm saying I think your point is spot on. It has to be fast. It has to be quick. It has to be having the capable people working with departments and quickly announcing that this is what we've achieved. That's the success. If you institutionalize us and become part of the normal public service, then there's no reason for us to exist, and I must go back into wherever I am, or actually be fired from the public service. That's the reality, right? I mean, that's why we have a professional, hardworking, a young team in my units that are driven, that are passionate, that work night and day, and that I can rely on, and that is, that we can do that. So if we become run of the mill, and then, what's the purpose then? So I,
Mm.
I I can't answer your other question. I mean, I think you've
Mm.
answered it partly, you know, but I certainly think from a bureaucracy point of view, we can do much better,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
I suppose my follow-on question you've partly answered, but let me, in your report released last week, you you tell us that the Public Service Commission Bill has been passed in the National Assembly, and that this seems to be, from what I know of it, a good thing. It's going to help professionalize the civil service and have better ways of appointing people and so on. All good. My question, I suppose, my worry is that's the right direction for the future. It's what do we do now? And that's a very hard issue where there are so many people who are in the civil service at very senior levels or throughout it that have not been part of this professional process and this new bill. And, from cadres, I don't think you're a cadre, but we can debate that somewhere else. But from people, let's just not use slogans, from people who've been appointed for the wrong reasons and who are not really able to do the very important jobs that the country needs. We have them sitting there now, and I think a big challenge is what do we do now? Between now
Mm.
and the new civil service, that seems to me to be a missing gap in how everybody's talking about this issue, whether at local government or at national government level. We've got
I mean,
sorry, yeah.
no, what I was saying, I mean, part of that was precisely, but remember, there is a professionalization framework. We do have standards for national and provincial bureaucrats like myself. But we're tightening that up, if you want to attract the right sort of skills into the public service, you have to have proper career pathing, you have to have fair rules, you have to have the ability to train, specialized work and a whole series of. So those are important parts, right? You got to do that. The main reform in that was extending the Public Service Commission to local government bureaucrats. That
Mm,
was the most important part. And that word matters, right? Because the interface between the political cycles and themselves are so close, right? I mean, this is the challenge that you have, particularly when you're close to that level of governance, that there's a lot of overlaps and sort of the political, sphere plays a lot in the decision of who the bureaucrats are or the bureaucratic program that you've adopted as a municipality. And that's something that you got to protect municipal
Mm.
officials because, of course, some may be threatened and said, if you don't do this, then we're dismissing you. It's not easy for them to do it to us if you don't do this. I mean, bureaucrats sometimes push back, as professionals. You also write about, I mean, I think that many people can't keep up. I engage with many of the public servants officials who, for example, interact with the reform. And I have never seen anyone say anything negative and say, this is what we need. This is from a DG, DDG, chief director, directors. Some of them have even said, we've been waiting for this sort of pace and work. And others would say, yo, you guys are too fast, right?
Yeah.
We're not coping with this. And I suppose what does happen is that people get weed out of the system. But I don't want to say this, perhaps we need to think about my union guys are going to hang me for this, but I'm going to say it. Perhaps we need to think about how we deal with professionalization and labor law for senior civil servants, right? A DG, a deputy director general, a chief director, you know? Can we think about how we deal with that so that, there are better ways of dealing with particular disputes where there's incapacity, where there's an inability for people to deliver, which is also incapacity.
Mm.
And maybe that's a useful debate to have, right? Do they have the same rights as a deputy director or level eight? I don't think they should. I think, if
I
I'm
agree.
incompetent, if I'm incompetent as a senior manager, which I am, I must be fired, man. I must walk away. I must have the decency and say, okay, well, I've been incompetent. Sorry, but don't
Yeah.
fire me because you want me to steal money. That's the reason I'll defend, right? But for me, I think there's a debate to be had, and I know my comrades from COSATU have pushed back against that, and many other the public service. I just think that's a genuine and open debate. If we want to
Mm.
transform, if we want to get the right people, think about how you get the right SMS people in. That's level
Mm.
15 DGs, level 4, level 16 DGs, level 15 DDGs like myself, and chief directors. Leave the
Yeah.
directors, they also SMS, but there are many of them. I just think that's a useful debate to have.
Thanks for that. I want to ask you two quick questions before we end. The first one is to go back to transport. When will we see cities begin to take over passenger rail? I can think of no rational reason why a national utility should run commuter rail in metros with capacity, and yet this reform keeps being pushed out. It's sort of beyond 2026. What's happening there? Is that something you could comment on?
I mean, there's genuine reasons why it has been pushed out. Ask any city whether they want to take it over as it is right now, and they'll say no, unless there's guarantees around subsidies and various forms of incentives. It's not easy doing that. Easy to talk about an integrated city. So many cities say, hey, we want to do it. And then you get into the nuts and bolts and say, okay, so are you taking responsibility for the infrastructure and the rail? Are you taking responsibility for the transfer of these workers? Are you dealing with scheduling? Do you integrate this with taxis and bus services and various other forms? It is not as easy as it is as we initially thought it. But we've got to move in that direction. And I think that principle still holds that we've got to
Hmm.
create, you've got to create a level of densification. That's why that reform is important. And the way you do
Yeah.
densification is by doing a demand side model, rental subsidy. You've done a lot of work on this, Anne. Instead of building houses for the sake of building houses and not bring it closer to the places of work, demand side subsidy. And the second component is transport and public transport. And rail is a pertinent part of that. You've got to develop an integrated system that does that. So that principle still holds.
Hmm.
And I think we've got to do that. But I think there's again more complications in this, what do you do with the assets? How do we transfer these assets? Who pays for it? What's the level of subsidization and all these kind of things? They're not easy to do. And ask the
No.
Gauteng government that runs the Gautrain. you know?
Well,
Uh,
there's one city that's asking for it, but I
they
understand.
ask for it and ask them whether they're prepared to take it as it is right now, and you
Well,
hear
they
the
need
answer.
funding for it. But
Yeah.
let me push to the end and ask you, so much of what you've said today and so much of what I understand of Operation Vulindlela is that with the president's backing, you've been able to do all sorts of things. The president, the minister of finance, and so on. But are you concerned about the local government elections, about the political trajectory of the country? And, what does that mean for Operation Vulindlela? Is there something you really want to do before things might change? How do you see it? It's a difficult question, but I'm sure you've thought about it.
If I would say, can we get all the reforms done? That for me would be the main objective. Can we do this in 2 years? Yes, we got to do that. We got to move with speed. Of
So
course, I have
27
concerns.
would be a key moment, or 26, end of 26 for you.
Absolutely. End of 2026 for me is a key moment. Running into 2027, those are the key moments. Again, it's the speed, the momentum. We got to keep that going. Of course, they always, anything related to this has serious political uncertainty. Let's assume that some parties come to power that are not wanting to see the private sector play an important role, would not want to see investments, and they take a different direction. And, we're in a tough situation. But I mean, what we have done is built in the sort of guardrails where we, for example, adopted the ERA. We've taken policy decisions in cabinet, for example, on these aspects. We're introducing further legislation or regulatory environment that makes it easier. I mean, I think it's important. It's the discipline of the system. It's ensuring that citizens are aware that we hold government to account. I mean, that's what you do. You've got to hold us to account. And ultimately, there's always risk in this, right? I mean, I may not be around, and I don't want, I'm not looking for longevity in the public service. I think I'll lose all my hair, but certainly you want to put into place where there's an important legacy for the president who has played such a central role in the reform program that people look back and say, President Ramaphosa has been supporting the Operation Vulindlela. He supported the reform program. He's transformed energy. He's transformed logistics, water, local government. And this is the legacy that he holds. And we've got to continue that because ultimately we know and we believe this that if we continue the reform, we are going to get better growth. We just have to be consistent at it. The question is, I know people say, but your reform is not seeing results. I do see the results. I do see confidence. I do see people coming back and saying, wow, we couldn't believe this. Of course, you got to do it. You got to work at this all the time. You got to sit with boards. You got to sit with CEOs and convince them why they've got to take capital decisions. You got to convince them to participate in the PSP or to build new generation plants for their firms because it may be too expensive to continue in the way that they are right now. So
Mm,
I'm really convinced. We've got to sustain that. We've got to, you know, a president that is fully supportive. And as long as that happens, we will see the reform continue. And I'm convinced we'll see the sort of growth that we'll see at the end of the day. The question is how fast. And of course, you are spot on. The faster we get to it, the better we see the numbers, right? That's the point thing. That's the most important thing. But again, there are, all things being equal, that's an easy thing said and done. There are many other dynamics to this, social, political, security-wise, capacity-wise. I can list them and you know them. They all play an important factor in the speed and whether you get this across the line quick or not. But I'm
mm.
I'm I'm really confident that we're on the right track and we've made the correct choices. And of course, we could have taken many other more reforms, but no, I think we made the right choice.
Great. Well, Rudy Dix, thank you very much for giving us this time and for being so generous and frank with your answers to my difficult questions. CDE was one of the, I think, the first organization to publicly welcome Operation Vulindlela when it was established in 2020, and more power to your arm. So well done
Thank you,
on
Anne.
all the work that you're doing. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you, Anne.
everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to close our discussion now. Thank you very much to Rudy. Great.
Did you like that? Did you like that, Uncle Jeff?
Are you talking to me?
No, no.
Oh, oh.